Thank you, Duncan. Um, Thank you, Ming. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad that you guys are here. I hope everyone's enjoying the holiday. I know I'm not necessarily enjoying the holiday. I'm just alive again another day, and that's a miracle. So, all right, let's see here. I'm doing this a little differently today because I am traveling, so I don't have two screens like normal, but I think um so we are on chapter 6. The chapter is entitled The New God Image. And so I guess we've been leading up to this point, for 6 weeks now. That is kind of laying the groundwork of this kind of, I guess, a journey. It's really a journey within. Um, it is, and hopefully we do some shadow work. At least we get familiar with what it looks like and what we're trying to encounter as we sort of take off from here. The So this is the book. It is available on my website. Also, these videos of these sessions are available there, and a few other videos will be posted there as well. You can get the book on my website if you want. You can also just get it off Amazon. There's Kindles available. Yeah, and also we do have the WhatsApp groups that are fun and exciting if you want to get involved there. We keep the group updated. I do post the slides there as well. And so, yes, and away we go. So, um, all right, I'm gonna just start by reading this. This is the first paragraph of chapter 6. It says, the nature of what we can expect to discover in our examination of the steps is purely psychological. Wilson intuited early on that his own recovery hinged upon an improved conscious contact with the higher power of his own conception, and he would go on to formulate a psychological procedure designed to bring about just that. Jung had learned from William James that psychological development is intrinsically spiritual, explaining that religious statements without exception have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of physis. The word psyche in Greek means soul, and for our purposes, the two are interchangeable. Whatever is spiritual is inherently psychological and vice versa. Jung discovered he could use religious symbols as a means to examine the inner workings of the psyche, and coupled with the psychological nature of the 12 steps, his findings suggest that the less adorned a religious statement is by symbolical language, the more purely psychological it will be. That is why, despite its lack of symbolical imagery, the 12 steps still represents a highly effective religious statement. And so what we're so the key things to really keep in mind here are that when we're talking about spiritual development, right, that or these spiritual experiences, really what's happening is and this is thanks to Jung, we understand this, is that it's a process of psychological development, right? Um, and and Jung understood these religious images to really depict the nature of the transformation that's taking place. So I was reminded of this over the weekend. So the Buddha um, once gave a sermon, and all he did was hold up a flower, and and then he just sat there in silence. And Joseph Campbell talks about this, and he says, what was the message that the Buddha was trying to give in this sermon? And I think it's a really interesting concept. It's because what you know. Uh, so we ask ourselves, what is the meaning of a flower, right? And the flower doesn't really have any meaning, right? It just is. The flower just exists. But I think that the important message to take away from this sermon is that the flower has reached its full potential, right? The flower became what it was supposed to become, and that's the miracle, right? And so the question that we want to ask ourselves as we go through this work is really, are we reaching our full potential? And the word we can use this is self-realization. The flower has become self-realized, right? And And so what is it that wants to manifest through us? What are we supposed to become as human beings, right? And we each have our own personal and kind of individual path to follow, so that we too can reach our full potential. um, so rationally, like the modern mind that we're all sort of cursed with, I guess, we want to sort of deduce the meaning of a flower from maybe like a scientific angle or something like that, and study it biologically and like look at its cells and everything that makes up the flower. Um, but and but the thing is about these religious images that we're going to be looking at, which one of them is the God image. Um, they're a lot like this flower, right? They don't necessarily have, it's not really the meaning that we're trying to get. Like more importantly is we're trying to have an experience of these symbols, right? We want to actually let the symbols live through us. Um, and as we do that, we begin to kind of uncover not more about the nature of the symbols, but we really start to learn about the nature of ourselves. So and the thing to keep in mind is that even in the 12 steps, and I think this is hard, it's kind of surprising for people, is that the 12 steps are full of the same religious symbols that the other religions are. They're just depicted in a different way, a little more psychologically than the other myths that we're used to. We've already looked at a lot of these symbols. We've seen the Achuma way, we've seen symbols. Mountain Lake told us about his myth. We've seen Jung's myth to some extent, Jaime's myth, right? As he was chasing the nature gods or whatever. So, but now we're going to start looking at our own myth, right? And we're gonna as we take this journey within, then what we begin to come up against right away is basically these God images, right? Or better said, our own God image. And so that's why this chapter, this journey really begins with this concept. This is Ettinger, and he's basically telling us the nature of these symbols, verse in the context of like what is consciousness, right? And what does it mean to be aware of stuff? So he says the rationalistic consciousness is so identified with the psyche that it can't perceive the objective reality of psychic imagery. From that point of view, images are nothing but a derivative of consciousness. So what we're looking at here is we're trying to reverse the way we understand these symbols. In other words, symbols don't derive, they're not a derivative of consciousness, right? It's actually the other way around. What the Jungians are telling us is that consciousness is actually derived from these symbols, and that as the ego develops throughout time as well as individually, the symbols are going to grow right alongside it. And so the ego that over identifies with rationality is not going to be able to understand these symbols as something sort of transcendent of itself. All right, so in this slide, so I love this slide because this is Joseph Smith I think in his first his little vision where he saw Jesus and Heavenly Father, which that was like a really big kind of thing in my own life. So it was fun to stumble across this image as I was kind of Google searching God images for these slides. Jung explains this phenomenon of the existence of these symbols this way. He says the psyche consists essentially of images. It is a series of images in the truest sense, not an accidental juxtaposition or sequence, but a structure that is throughout full of meaning and purpose. It is a picturing of vital activities. Mind and body are the expression of a single entity. This living being appears outwardly as the material body, but inwardly as a series of images of the vital activities taking place within it. So, in other words, these images are really telling us the story of what's taking place behind the veil of consciousness, right? Behind kind of this egoic kind of rationalistic perception that we have of the world, right? The symbols are telling us how this, if the spiritual journey is a journey of psychological transformation, then the symbols are telling us what that transformation looks like, where we are in the process, what we can expect, what we've already been through. And these are all things that we can't necessarily see, right? This process is transcendent. Like the best we can do is try to describe it. Um, Campbell quotes somebody, I can't remember who, but saying that the best things in life are um can't be told, and the second best are highly misunderstood because they're expressions of that thing that can't actually be expressed. The other thing to keep in mind is that we're going to be looking at these symbols as dynamic, right? Not static, right? Um so so they're a lot like a seed. So if the psyche or the human psychology, you could imagine it as like some soil, right? And these symbols are like seeds that are planted in the soil. And when we water these seeds, they begin the seeds, the first they die and then they break apart and then they begin to sprout. And as they do so, they actually expand and they actually change the soil that they're planted in. So when we do the same thing with the symbols, then that's what begins to change us, right? We start to change from the inside out. As our conception of the symbols change, we start to change. And interestingly, the more dynamic we allow these symbols to be rather than static. So dynamic means changing, static means fixed, right? Like concrete. So the more dynamic we allow the symbols to be, then the more pliable the ego will be, and the more actually we're going to be able to experience a psychic change. So these symbols, so we know that these symbols exist in the psyche. They're these substantial things, right? And as we shine the light of consciousness on them, they begin to grow and they change. They change us from the inside out. And I had come across this idea as I was writing my book, and then I actually read this in Mysterium Connectionis like 2 days ago. I read this paragraph from Jung, which he basically says the same thing. It is really as if attention warmed the unconscious and activated it, thereby breaking down the barriers that separate it from consciousness. In other words, when we shine the light of consciousness on these symbols, they're no longer these fixed kind of solid entities, and they begin to break apart, and the psyche breaks apart and it becomes pliable. Now, this is why we can say, so it's important to keep in mind that like psychology and religion are two paths that lead towards the same goal. And that can be hard for us, I think, in the 12 steps. We have a lot of kind of dogma around that. Like we say, oh, the 12 steps aren't a religion, or, just whatever. I was having a conversation early on in writing the book, and I had become just completely obsessed with Jung. And I was talking to a close friend of mine. We were having lunch, and he was like, dude, he's like, I don't understand like your obsession with Carl Jung. Like, this isn't psychology, like this is spirituality. The two things are completely different. And I was like, dude, like, it's not the case. Like, if you read Carl Jung, all he writes about is God and the God image and the nature of this process that we're engaged in. Um, so, and I think, it's kind of funny. I probably wrote this paragraph in response to that conversation. So, and this is essentially, it's basically the second paragraph. It says, Wilson knew that lasting transformation hinges on a change in psyche first. The life circumstances have little to do with one's ability to have a transformative experience. When the spiritual malady is overcome, then we straighten out mentally and physically, he wrote. That is because the main problem of the alcoholic centers in the mind. Wilson had learned as much from Dr. Silkworth back at Towns, who concluded from his own research in treating upwards of 40,000 alcoholics that in addition to the physical condition the alcoholic suffers from, which the doctor dubbed the phenomenon of craving, there is a mental component that must also be overcome. Until the alcoholic is able to experience an entire psychic change, there is little hope of his or her recovery. The same psychological factors that drove us to become powerless are what makes our lives unmanageable, and must be countered by a psychological process that Wilson ultimately referred to as a spiritual awakening. The entire psychic change involves a fundamental shift that takes place in the baseline of our individual consciousness, illustrated in the powerful prescription that Jung gave to Roland when he explained that the vital spiritual experience required to treat alcoholism is marked by huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of these men's and women's lives, are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate. Thus, our individual psychology forms the basis of our spiritual development, top to bottom, inside and out. And so, the problem, right? We know the problem exists in the mind, but we also need to understand that that's where Jung would teach that that's where the solution also exists. And so keep in mind, so we're talking about the symbols having their sort of home within the psyche, right? And when I say that the problem exists in the mind and so does the solution, it's because that's where those symbols are. And so, again, as the symbols change, a solution begins to present itself. So the main problem with the hyper-rationalistic approach of the modern mind is that, again, we see these symbols as a derivative of consciousness rather than the other way around. And so, and what happens too is that we have a really, really hard time seeing understanding these images, especially those of our myths, as symbols. We don't really understand them as symbols. And this becomes a real big problem whether we believe in a religion or whether we don't believe in a religion, right? Taking a mythology at face value will tend to, basically destroy the numinosity that we would get out of it, the same as just not believing in a religion simply because it can't be true. Like, it can't be taken literally, right? So the problem is how we view these things, whether we view them symbolically. This is what Jung says. And I love this because Jung wrestled with these things the same way so many of us do, as Wilson writes in We Agnostics. So Jung says, we cannot turn back the clock, and one cannot turn back the clock and force oneself to believe. What one knows is not true. But one could give a little thought to what the symbols really mean. In this way, would not only the incomparable treasures of our civilization be conserved, but we should also gain new access to the old truths which have vanished from our rational purview because of the strangeness of their symbolism. How can a man be God's son and be born of a virgin? That is a slap in the face of reason. And it's meant to be a slap in the face of reason. Today, such dogmas fall on deaf ears because nothing in our known world responds to such assertions. But if we understand these things for what they are, as symbols, then we can only marvel at the unfathomable wisdom that is in them and be grateful to the institution which has not only conserved them, but developed them dogmatically. The man of today lacks the very understanding that would help him to believe. As a metaphysical truth, religious symbols remained wholly inaccessible to me, and I suspect that I am by no means the only one to find himself in that position. So I know for me personally, like I'd mentioned earlier that, the story of Joseph Smith, like having his first vision or whatever, that was like a thing that I sort of, I chose to believe in, I guess, for a while in my life. And so then what came out of that is just sort of an understanding of all the Christian dogma, just this whole thing about Christianity. But as I started dabbling in the 12-step fellowships and stuff and went through my whole, thing with drugs and alcohol, when I came back in, I essentially I would like reject Christianity just because, on the basis that that stuff just can't be true. It just doesn't make any sense. You can't, a child can't be born of a virgin. That's like an impossibility, right? But so I don't know, writing this book, I guess, has helped me to come back. I just became open-minded, right? To look at these symbols from a different perspective, to look at them symbolically, right? And what I found was that there indeed is unfathomable wisdom contained within these symbols. And that no matter how spiritual I was being, trying to practice the religion of a different culture, different, spiritual methods, yoga, meditation, whatever it was, that when I came back to the symbols of my own culture and started to look at them symbolically, things began to unlock, like in my psyche and in my life, that couldn't have happened otherwise. The reason is because these symbols evolve along with this, with our psychology, right? That and as we change, the symbols change, and as the symbols change, we change, and this happens collectively as well as individually. So, and what I referred to in the next paragraph is basically how we see how Jung interprets these things symbolically, basically the way he does with the Tao Smith, right? That him contemplating the Tao Smith from his own his own hyper personal perspective is what allowed him to unlock his own myth of meaning, right? And it's sort of a reflection of the Tao Smith, but all myths are kind of reflections of each other, anyways. So and again, Jung Jung did this though. He did this with the Tao Smith. He did this with myths of many different cultures, including the myth of his own culture. So a lot of people will accuse Jung of being a Christian. I don't know if accuse is the right word, but he is not a Christian. Like, Jung encouraged Christians to be Christians. He encouraged Catholics to stay in the Catholic Church. He encouraged Jews to be Jews, but he didn't really, he didn't buy into the dogma of any of these religious cultures, but he studied them and he looked for the meaning in them that he could apply to his own life. So Jung is not a Christian. So we're looking at now. So what Jung develops then is the psychological approach. That's what we looked at kind of in the last paragraph. And this becomes a really key element as we go through this, right? And this is how I define the psychological approach. It's whereby we draw out personal meaning from the symbols directly, recognizing our own journey into the psychic depths reflected therein, exactly what is conveyed in the 12 steps. And so again, the 12 steps have sort of, they depict the same journey as the other myths, but they've essentially wiped away a whole bunch of this symbolical film. That's what we talked about last session. And they become more explicitly psychological, right? And so they are a psychological journey. When I do a 4-step and then I present it to my sponsor in the 5th step, the demons that I'm facing are really my own psychological demons, right? Like, I have to come up against my own reluctance, my own unwillingness, my own obstinacy, all this stuff. When I make amends, it's the same thing. Like, I'm having a psychological experience, and what we learn from those experiences, right, is part of this process. And it's really a deflation of the ego that's taking place. And that is what is depicted in all of the myths. So, and now here's the thing concerning religion, right? And just really conventional religion, is that this psychological approach stands in direct opposition to the way we normally approach religious symbols, whether we're believers or not. And that's the key here, right? It's not about whether I believe in the symbols or whether I believe in Christianity or whether I believe in Judaism, right? It's more about it's how I approach these symbols and how I understand them. This is why we can say that the myths of all religions are actually true, right? This is sort of like in the 12 steps, we say, that everybody's conception of God is legitimate for them. That's great, but we can even go on a much bigger sort of universal scale and say the myths of all cultures are true in a certain sense, but they're all false also, right? Taken literally, none of the myths are true. This is what I say. Such a change in perspective, so adopting this psychological approach, is key to unlocking a deeper understanding of our own spiritual quest. And it sits in sharp contrast to the commonly held practice handed down by generations of conventional religion that Jung called the metaphysical approach, which holds that religious symbols are concrete objects and or historical facts, and that as such, they should be taken at face value. As Westerners, the metaphysical approach is the one our minds are pre-programmed to run, whether we believe in the religious dogma or not. It is our doctrinal code, so to speak, and for many of us, our spiritual operating system is frozen, stuck trying to load the metaphysical approach and currently unable to accept any new input. Such a perspective is our greatest hindrance to our progression into the realm of the psyche, even if we are staunch non-believers of any particular faith, because it dims the useful lamppost that might have otherwise lit the path inward by reflecting upon the ancient imagery as a dynamic inherent within. So what we have here then, and this was sort of I guess a key kind of concept that I stumbled on. Um, you know, I'm actually interested to get, your feedback on it, but it's like, as Westerners, we're sort of born into this culture where we can only we take everything so hyper kind of literally and rationalistically that we cannot really, that we just have no way of really looking at, say, like the flood that is in the Bible, right? I mean, science has basically proven that the flood didn't happen, right? And I mean, you can find some science that maybe says it has or whatever, right? But the argument about whether the flood was real or not is actually to miss the point entirely. To argue whether the Garden of Eden exists in Missouri or not is to miss the point entirely, right? As myths, these symbols are actually, they exist without the sort of the confines of time and space. They're taking place for everybody, right? In every walk of life. And they're much like our dreams. They're telling us where we are in the process right now, where I am individually right now. That's what these religious symbols are trying to tell me, not what happened in real life at such and such a time or such and such a place. So that's what I'm going to call the metaphysical approach. So, and it may be different from other usages of the term metaphysical. I know, like, I've heard some people use metaphysical almost the same way I use the word psychological, but I'm just following Jung's lead here and saying that the metaphysical approach is to sort of understand these things literally versus the psychological approach, which is to understand them, psychologically. Wilson's approach, so this is where we come back to the 12 steps now. And this is why I think at least one reason why the steps are so effective. Is that Wilson had also adopted a psychological approach. And this is where I actually disagree with William Schaberg. But I see how he arrived at his conclusion, which is basically that Wilson was trying to convince people that there was a personal God out in the universe that you could pray to and get help from. And that certainly is the story that's told in the big book and in the 12 steps. But what makes the steps so effective and this whole program so effective is that there's a completely other way of seeing it, where you actually can understand that what Wilson was really trying to put forth was this sort of deeper, kind of this deeper understanding, what I'm calling what Jung called the psychological approach. And I'm going to offer some evidence to that in the next few slides. So what I say is this. Wilson learned from working with so many newcomers that his alcoholic readers would be similarly jaded by religious dogma, writing an entire chapter called We Agnostics. In it, he begs us to discard old ideas we have about spirituality and religion, and to adopt an approach towards such concepts from a perspective comparable to Jung's. Do not let any prejudice you have deter you from honestly asking yourself what spiritual terms mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood him. Throughout the big book, Wilson demonstrates how easily one may pivot from the metaphysical approach. In the first chapter, Bill's story, he shares how he came upon his own unique psychological perspective, beginning with the most fundamental symbol of Western myth, what Jung called the God image. Wilson tells us that when Ebbe came to visit in Towns Hospital, he shared about the religious method he had been introduced to by Roland Hazard and the Oxford Group. Listening to Ebbe's newfound religious convictions, Wilson felt that he couldn't believe in the God Ebbe had talked about. He understood Ebbe's notion of God to be of the metaphysical variety, a variation of the same conception of the deity that all Westerners are born with. And so here, so now enter the God image. This is going to be talked about over and over and over in the coming pages, and it is the first thing we encounter when we take our own journey inward, the spiritual walk. We do step one, and then the first thing we come up against is step two, right? It's like, do I believe in this God image? What is the God image? Like, go home and make a list, right? All that kind of stuff of what is God to you. And so and but this God image is really Jung basically would explain that it's kind of the foundation of human psychology, right? It's like the most basic image that we hold is the God image. And as Wilson says, that can be obscured by pomp, and all sorts of other things, but that fundamentally it's there deep down in every man, woman, and child. And in as much as the God image is an empirical reality that exists in the human psyche, then the transformation of the God image equates to the transformation of the human psyche. In other words, as the human psychology changes, so does the God image. Again, that happens collectively as well as individually. And this is a quote from Edinger in his commentary on Jung's Mysterium Cognitionis. And I really like this because I only really kind of discovered this after the fact, but I think it's written into the book either way, into my book. So it says the death of the old dominant, the Western God image, corresponds to the fact that the God image, the collective dominant of the Western psyche, is moribund, meaning at the point of death. In preparation for its death, it opens up an ancient tomb. In other words, it opens up the unconscious. This activates the feminine principle, which had been dead and buried in that exact same tomb. As the tomb is opened, it is penetrated by consciousness, and as consciousness ventures into it, a revitalization occurs. The God image is resurrected and becomes active. And so, for example, I love this because and I'm just going to use the Christian myth because that's the one I understand the most. But you could do this with any myth, right? That the same thing that happens in the big picture happens individually. So, so what happens then, for example, is that as he's resurrected, right? And the image becomes conscious. So this could be compared to Wilson when he says he sees the Tsar of Heaven, right? Or whatever. He imagines the Tsar of Heaven. And he says, I just couldn't stomach it. So basically then that God image dies, boom, and it goes into the tomb. And what Jung tells us, or what Edinger tells us, is that sort of releases a feminine energy, which could be symbolized by the Holy Ghost, right? But what happens is the God image is resurrected, and it has like this new life, this new sort of power, this new personality. And so the same thing that's happening in this myth is what's taking place in our own consciousness as we're evolving and experiencing the psychic change. That's why I call this an immaculate conception, right? The idea of Jesus being born of a virgin and all that is an immaculate conception, but this new God image is also an immaculate conception. Jung said every one of these steps signifies a rebirth of the deity, and he's not referring to the 12 steps, but it certainly would apply to the 12 steps as well. The God image sits moribund in the psyche, and when we shine the light of consciousness upon it, a metamorphosis occurs, and the God image it essentially it resurrects and leads us towards a psychic change. And I wanted to throw this in here. These symbols, these we're talking about these symbols having sort of this duplicitous meaning, right? They apply to us as individuals. They also apply to the entire civilization. Dreams have the same sort of two interpretations as well. And one of these is the reductive interpretation, right? That's where the dream is broken down, and it basically is meant to symbolize a person's like undeveloped psyche, right? And this is what but then there's this other aspect, which is the archetypal interpretation. So Edinger says this: the early part of the analytical process is largely a procedure in which primitive effects are analyzed reductively. This means, in effect, that the ego is required to take responsibility for such behavior. Now, this is what I kind of learned as I was actually writing this presentation, is that the reductive component of this alcoholic complex or addiction, right, that we're dealing with, is what we do with our sponsor, right? As we go through the steps, that's exactly what we do. Is we analyze the primitive effects of our own life psychologically, right? We And then we take responsibility for those things, right? And he says the ego it's required to take responsibility. So even though we didn't cause our alcoholism or our drug addiction, we are responsible to fix it, right? So kind of that first run through with the steps, or maybe the first decade or two in sobriety, whatever, is really spent in this sort of reductive I guess posture or whatever. But I was thinking about this because Murray Stein, in the blurb that he wrote for my book, he says that my approach really takes um alcoholism and addiction out of this sort of reductive container and look at it from a far more sort of archetypal or synthetic perspective, which is like synthetic would be the synthesis of the ego and the self. And so once we've done this reductive work, right, then we open ourselves up then to go a level deeper into our own psyche, really, where we start to look at these archetypal things, and we can look at the disease as an archetype, the archetype of the alcoholic. We also look at the God image as another archetype, right? The higher power is an archetype. And as archetypes, we see them as things that exist deep within us. Like, it's not about God out there in heaven. It's more about, like, what is this image? What part of my own psyche and my own being does this image represent? So, and this archetypal perspective is the goal if we want to overcome these complexities, right? I love this statement from Edinger, because it really sums up recovery from alcoholism to a T. He says the compulsive dynamic of all complexities derives from the self. The self is sort of the underlying archetype. So the God image is a reflection of the self. And we're going to talk about the self much later on, but I'm going to start sprinkling it in here and there. So the compulsive dynamic of all complexities derives from the self. When you see that, then you don't have a complex anymore, which doesn't mean, however, that you aren't subject to inflammable effects. Not at all. But it does mean that you are experiencing them on a deeper level, and they become part of an ongoing dialogue between the ego and the self. Before one sees that such things derive from the self, one is in constant danger of being possessed by a complex. In other words, of catching on fire from the inflammability of the sulfur in the complex. So, this is a profound statement, because basically what I've proposed, like kind of in my book, is that once we understand the archetypal nature of like alcoholism and addiction, and see it as being really this collective sort of response to the world's mythlessness, right? And that it was the self who sort of laid these traps, but with the purpose of waking us up and waking us up to its existence, right? Then that's actually what really solves the problem of alcoholism and drug addiction, right? And again, to get there, we have to go into this more archetypal level. That's where real recovery happens. So the reductive is very important and it's necessary, right? But if we want to have a deeper experience, we've got to go deeper. And I want to give just like a pretty simple example, I guess, of to compare this reductive approach to the archetypal approach. So recently I've been having dreams about dead bodies, right? Like there's been a murder. And in the dreams, I'm either trying to cover up for the murder, or I'm literally trying to bury the bodies. Like I'm trying to hide the bodies from the authorities. And so the reductive kind of approach to these dreams, right, which is pretty common. Like if I was to Google it, this is probably what would come up, is that, oh, I must be hiding something. I'm trying to like, it's part of my shadow, this shadow complex. I'm hiding maybe I'm hiding something from my wife or whatever it is, right? Which, and look, some of that stuff could be true. And it's the psyche will tell you if that's actually the case. Like, if you're hiding something, right? That's the reductive approach. The synthetic or the archetypal approach would suggest otherwise, right? That, and this is it. And it's almost shocking to say this, but that, yes, there has been a murder, and yes, I committed the murder, and what I killed was an old aspect of myself, right? This old adaptive personality was literally murdered, and now I'm going to bury it because I don't need it anymore. and that's the archetypal approach, and that's so and that's the approach that we will see in the myths, right? The archetypal approach to our dreams will be reflected in the myths to a very high degree. Now, so the archetypal approach necessitates, or the psychological approach, I guess, necessitates that we plunge into the darkness of our own psyche, right? The final frontier. And so as we turn to Bill's story, we're going to look at this, and what we're going to see is really how he did it, right? And I make this case throughout the rest of the book, was that Bill Wilson he had formulated a psychological approach to this whole transformation process, basically like, tangentially with Jung, without knowing any of Jung's theories. So, which is a really surprising, I guess, outcome. And by looking at Wilson's approach, it really helps to highlight what Jung was talking about. I mean, just to put it in perspective, is that I'm a guy that dropped out of high school. I got a GED, and I got an associate's degree at a really small, community college. I was not a great college student, but and when I picked up Jung and started reading it, like, it wasn't that hard for me to understand, like, because this is the process that we're talking about in the 12 steps. And once I kind of put that together, all of this stuff just started to really make sense. And then I was able to write it into a book that got published by a major Jungian publishing house. Now I'm being, invited to speak and stuff and talk about this stuff. But you guys, this is not groundbreaking stuff. Like, I didn't do anything special, except I wrote down some things about the process that we are going through. But it's so similar to the Jungian process that it's sort of fascinating to the Jungian crowd. So, it's just, this kind of shows really how profound and how meaningful and penetrating this process that we're engaged in really is. So we're looking at, so again, we're going to turn, I mean, Bill Wilson's sort of the poster child, right? His experience is the one we're all trying to have. And so let's start looking at it. So, and this is what Bill says. So just to catch people up, so Bill had plunged into the dark. He was dying of alcoholism. Ebby had gone to New York and got sober. He was working with Roland Hazard, and he heard that Bill Wilson was in trouble. So he goes to visit Bill. He shows up, bright-eyed and glowing, as Bill says. And he says, I think Bill says, what's going on? He says, I got religion, and Bill's like, oh, Jesus Christ, but there was something about Ebby that Bill had to pay attention to, right? And so they're sitting there, and this is what happens. He says, this is Bill writing in Bill's story. He says, despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. Now, that old prejudice is the metaphysical approach, okay? The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. So he's really defining the metaphysical approach there, right? That is the conventional Western conception of religion, and it doesn't work for most people. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. And so these are the four mysterious paragraphs that made their way into the manuscript before it went out to print. And I asked Bill Shaberg about these paragraphs specifically during the interview, and I recall that he said, we don't know where Bill got this idea, but it is the defining characteristic of 12-step spirituality, right? This ability to take a psychological approach for people who need to. What happens then and this, I love what Shaberg said, and I might have actually, we might come across it, but he basically says it's a breathtaking innovation because it sort of, it dissolves, centuries of doctrinal disputes, which is really, really profound. Um, this is what I say about Bill's story. What we just read. Like many, Wilson's journey toward a spiritual awakening began with his reconciliation with the God image. His myth provides a template for those of the agnostic ilk who struggle to connect to traditional Western symbolism, who must also shift their perspective to a psychological one if they are to seize upon the transformational energy available through such symbols. Demonstrated time and again in the fellowships is just how effective such a change in perspective can be. In Wilson's case, the moment he sincerely considered the unorthodox approach Ebbe suggested, allowing his own God image to morph into a psychological construct, he was catapulted into a new way of perceiving the world, what he called the fourth dimension of existence. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact upon me was sudden and profound. The entire 12-step movement grew out of Wilson's acceptance of a psychological interpretation of the God image, for he quickly realized that there were thousands of alcoholics who might gladly have what had been so freely given to him, a God we can do business with, as we often hear in meetings. Since then, recovery culture has become saturated with a God concept similar to the one Wilson and Jung discovered, suggesting that the road to recovery doesn't begin when one decides to quit drinking at all, but rather with one's decision to reconceive the symbol of God for oneself. Once that fundamental psychic change occurs, it opens the door to a cascade of emotional displacements and rearrangements that Jung promised Roland would follow. The simplicity of Ebbe's response to Bill represents perhaps the most distinguishing aspect of 12-step spirituality, its ability to fundamentally change the way Westerners access God's power. And and then here's this is the Shaberg quote. He says, such a pragmatic and very American approach, similarly dismissing thousands of years of doctrinal disputes, is a breathtaking innovation, transforming the spiritual program of action suggested by Alcoholics Anonymous into a viable option for all but the most obstinate non-believers. And again, I think that Shaberg's being a little overly simplistic here because to me, it's not just the obstinate non-believers or the agnostics that get to really partake of the fruits, right? Like that there's something else that's more moving about this approach that allows us to actually tap into the power and experience these psychic changes on a wholesale basis. And it's not because it's not just like a sneaky way of getting people to practice religion, right? Like there's something different happening here, which is like that the 12 steps, like first of all, we burn our lives to the ground. And so we're really forced to find a new way of life. So we become absolutely open-minded, right? Just like Bill was. But then what they do is they really turn a mirror and have us begin to look inward almost immediately. And as we go inside, we're looking for this power. We're looking for an experience of spiritual connection. And so rather than sort of, as he says, imagining figures of light, that Jung said that a person does not achieve enlightenment by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So the darkness, in the end, like Chamberlain says, we uncover, discover, discard. But that real darkness that we're trying to make conscious within us is actually the image of God. We're looking for that image within. So one of my main theses in the book is that the 12-step fellowships in general have adopted a psychological approach, and that almost goes without saying at this point. Even though certain individuals may not have adopted a psychological approach, I think overall we have adopted a psychological approach, and this truly is an immaculate conception. I say this groundbreaking idea for the modern West would be carefully built upon by Wilson and friends in the early days of AA, cementing a psychological framework for understanding the God image from its very beginning. The what naturally unfolded from Ebby's invitation for Wilson to choose his own conception of God was the statement that was practically stapled onto steps 3 and 11, God as we understood him. In the 12-step fellowships, each member believes that every other member's conception of God is as viable as their own in bringing to pass individual transformation, regardless of who or what that conception is. One might even hear an old-timer gently reassure a newcomer struggling to develop a personal relationship with a higher power, do you believe that I believe? If so, then you can use my higher power until you find one for yourself. In the meantime, make a list of all the attributes you want your God to have, then start asking it to keep you sober each day, and we'll see what happens. After only a few weeks or months, that same person who formerly struggled with practically every aspect of life will have found a God they can trust and begun to transform their lives from the inside out. And that is just the story that we're all so familiar with, right? That and it's such a simple process. It's so mind-blowingly simple. But it works. Like, it's so practical, it just works over and over. As William James would say, it has cash value, right? And Wilson, he understood this as like a business transaction almost. As long as we bring the willingness and the open-mindedness to the table. So in conclusion, I write, in many ways, the God of the 12 steps is identical to the subjectively conditioned God that Jung pursued throughout his career, of which there is neither question nor debate about whether or not it is real or whose conception is the one true one. In fact, the nature of the God image is almost never discussed in 12-step meetings. Participants understand that the word God is just a placeholder, that the particular God concept of any individual member is not important, that each may believe in their own way and still affect a viable relationship with whatever God they choose. Thus, the fluidity of the God image as a symbol, rather than its dogmatic fixedness, is paramount in the 12-step fellowships, even for those members who still believe in a more conventional conception. One anonymous member often shares a profound truth that seems to have been lost upon much of the West. In our fellowship, even God is anonymous. In a similar sentiment, Jung said that God has 1,000 names. And if 12-step experience has taught us anything, it is that those 1,000 names have 10,000 different meanings. Wilson thus urges his readers to consider a God of their own understanding as they follow him down the trail of self-searching and self-discovery, for the power we need to recreate our lives can only be found buried beneath our longest-held religious preconceptions. And so, with that, I will turn it back to Duncan.
Wow. Let me get everyone so you can unmute, and we will have our collective cacophony of appreciation. So feel free to unmute. Thank you.
Powerful. Appreciate
Thank
Cody,
you.
Cody, passionate, powerful.
Cody,
Cody,
Cody, Cody. Oh, wow. Today was especially mind-blowing.
Egyptian.
Yes, okay. We're gonna mute again and move toward a question and answer session. Wow, today was particularly mind-blowing. I really enjoyed this material. This is so important. All right, let me tell you what we're going to do next as a group. We're going to have a Q&A for about 30 minutes. We'll open up for questions and answers. Each person will have about 1 minute to reflect or ask a question. I will, I'll show you my watch or something if you're still talking at 1 minute, please wrap it up so we can hear more from Cody and more questions and so forth. We are recording the question and answer. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can put your question in the chat, probably either to me or to everyone, so that I can filter your chat questions in to the Q&A session. Cody probably may not be able to watch the chat while he's taking questions. So send your question to me or to everyone so we'll all see it. And then I will filter those in, and I will call on raised hands. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And the first hand I see is Sharon. And I will,
I'm on mute.
oh, okay.
Okay, Cody, thank you. This was a phenomenal session. I'm so glad I was here. My question has to do with emotional displacements and rearrangements and psychic changes. And the exact question is, did you come across anything in your research that indicated neuroplasticity changes as well as what Bill W. says about emotional displacements and rearrangements? Because it's been a period of time since Jung did what his work, and I'm wondering if the neuroscientists have caught up to see that there's actual changes in the brain. That's my question, and I will now go quiet.
I appreciate your question. So I didn't do much studying of like the neurosciences, right? I kind of have been pretty focused on the psychology, which I think is a little different. I think the psychology is focusing more on the images and the thought patterns and just stuff like that, whereas the neurosciences are probably more focused on the chemicals and the actual sort of the function, like the brain itself, right? So I don't have much to say about that, but I think that it is an interesting I think it's an interesting question. I think that I often think about those brain pathways and my different responses and stuff and how that kind of plays in, but I don't have anything of really any authority to say on it, I guess. So, but thanks for your question.
Yeah, I would chime in that neuroplasticity helps and does probably improve by switching from the metaphysical approach to the psychological approach. I mean, you're talking about it. Deborah C., please come in and ask a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't ready. I was spacing out. Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks, Cody. Thank you, Duncan. I posted earlier about the traditions, because like it's great when, religious person, a leader gets enlightenment and then it's into reality, right? That's how we can work this out in the day-to-day affairs of our life. And so what I posted, right, was that the steps prevent suicide. We know this expression, and the traditions prevent homicide, and the concepts prevent genocide. And, like, I'm wondering, that, and this is like maybe volume 2, right? Like, how did it get incorporated into a date, like on the real ground, because we can have a wonderful enlightenment. Because it seems like Jaime, he couldn't like take it back into the real world. That's sort of what I'm sensing. Yeah. So if you could talk about that, thank you.
Dave,
So, yeah. I haven't done a lot of work with the concepts. Like I'm not really even familiar. I'm familiar with a couple of them as they sort of affect, as I get affected by my home group, I like to bring out some of the concepts to be like, hey, you're not supposed to do that or whatever. I think that the traditions are equally inspired as the steps. I mean, and if you read that first forward to the book Alcoholics Anonymous contains like a lot of the concepts that would later filter into the 12 traditions. So those were things that he was already really kind of understanding and kicking around, when he wrote the book so early on. I think that the traditions are, the one that strikes me the most, and you guys have probably heard me say this, is tradition number 2, where God manifests himself in our group conscience. If we go back to like the myth of Jesus, so Jesus is killed and he's put in the tomb and he resurrects, and then so what happens is then in the process of like the psychological change is that we see the God image, we see the Czar of Heaven or whatever, and we're like, oh, hey, that's not for me. Like I need something else. And so we sort of kill the God image and it goes into the tomb or into the unconscious, right? But what emerges then is this power, this universal mind, and or the, creative intelligence, God consciousness, right? Wilson calls it in the appendix. So, but then what happens in the myth of the Christian myth is that spirit then is disseminated upon the earth, right? So that this sort of psychological conception of the deity is now disseminated to everywhere, right? And that is a manifestation, like that's what's happening then in if the 12 steps are sort of building on this immaculate conception, then the logical conclusion almost is that God now expresses himself not just in my conscience, but in the group conscience. So we're all sort of manifestations of this thing, but it's really just, in a weird way of looking at it, it's just a continuation of the Christian myth. So, and it's built on the myth a little bit, a lot actually, because Bill understood Christianity, right? So I think, I talk about the reconciliation with the God image. I say that a few times, I think, in the book, because we are having to face this entity that, and I know for me, in my case, I had been praying for years to be struck sober, wondering why it wasn't working. Like, I think this is supposed to be what's going on here. Doesn't God want me to be sober? So when I finally make it in, there is this necessity of having to sort of, I don't know, almost like call this God image like into question, like, hey, where were you? Why didn't you, answer my prayers? You know what I mean? And that's like a story I think we hear a lot in the steps. And the power then really starts to manifest. So I'll give you a quick story. My sponsor early on, this time around, I said, hey, I don't really think this is going to work. If I'm being honest, like, I don't have any evidence in my life that the 12 steps are going to keep me sober, because I had been in and out for 10 years. And he said, that's really good news, Cody, because the people who come in and just know that it's going to work and believe in it 100%, those are the ones who don't make it. The ones who stick around are the ones who actually have to wrestle with it. And so what's happening here is that as we reconcile with this God image, we're really having to look at it from a very personal perspective and really answer these hard questions about our own belief and our own relationship to it. And when we do that, that's when we start shining the light of consciousness on that seed and it begins to sprout.
Thanks, Cody. Patrick.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Cody. Thanks, everybody. This is a wonderful session again. Okay, Cody, here we go. Could you comment on this idea? For each and every one of us in recovery, our hitting bottom is the equivalent on the mythical level of the crucifixion.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is the thing, and there's a few things that come to mind for me in regards to Jesus's relationship with his Father, who he thought was love. Is that in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he's experiences sort of the sins of all the world, he basically prays. He's like, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, right? If not, whatever, I'll do it, I guess, right? And then I think on the cross, just before he dies, Jesus says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Or Father, why have you forsaken me? And that really, there's so many, like, I think psychological kind of ideas we could explore. But that it really does. I mean, the thing about our experience here in the 12 steps is that we I don't know, we go through this stuff in such a like a clear sort of, I mean, this shit is happening to us in real life, right? So those, once we see those things as like these symbols, then it's like, oh, that is my story for sure. You know, the concept of, you know, because what's happening here is that the ego plays God, right? The ego, you know, in the myth of Jesus, like Jesus ran around playing God, he was changing water into wine, all this stuff, right? And then in the end, he's like, wait a second, where is this power? It's gone. And there's sort of a, you know, there's this aloneness, and then the ego dies. I mean, so Jesus, in the myth, Jesus is a really good representation of the ego. He's also a representation of the self from other perspectives. The resurrected Jesus certainly is a representation of the self, but the human Jesus is a representation of the ego. And the Father, God the Father, is representative of the self. And what we're going to talk about in, you know, coming sessions a lot is how the self is laying these it's sort of laying these traps that are meant to trip up the ego and to make it realize that it's not actually in control. And so so yeah, when there was something else I was going to say, but it just escaped my mind. Oh, yeah, I talked about this earlier, that interesting. So, you know, we read the quote from Edinger that the ego has to take responsibility for these things, right? That in the reductive sort of part of this process that we're going through, that, you know, it requires, like what Wilson says, that we have to, you know, that we have to see that our troubles are of our own making. They arise out of ourselves. And the alcoholic is an example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. That when we talk about the self, right, this entity, this psychological entity that's represented by the God image in myth, it's really interesting to me that the self is also just really this part of me that's like makes really bad decisions, that like encourages me to like burn my life to the ground, you know, that and that it's that thing that I'm actually, in the end, that's what I'm looking for, right? And it doesn't really, you know, this flies in the face of this religious sort of, you know, the conventional religious idea that we have in the West, that the self and the higher power, these images of light, and that's what we're chasing after. But the truth is, we're trying to find that when we say that our troubles are of our own making, what, you know, the real advance happens when we recognize that the same thing we're seeking in step 2 and 3 was really at the base of step 1 as well, right? That it's the same power. It's just these two, it's this bipolar nature of this thing that we're seeking. And that's where, you know, the good and evil kind of come together and you know, create this spiritual awakening.
Thank you. Terry, I saw your hand up. Now your hand's not up. Dave's hand is up. Dave.
Thanks so much, Duncan. Hi, Dave, alcoholic. Is the aim of the book, your expectation of writing it, that some of this understanding and insights that you are sharing will filter down onto ground level AA? Because I hate to be the one to break the news, but it's not there just yet, right? My experience in my first year or so in traditional AA is very much, it's Sky Daddy, and we'll say your understanding of it until such time as you acknowledge it's Sky Daddy, and then we'll be okay. So are you hoping that it will eventually, or will the secular movement simply grow into a more separate movement where these kind of concepts are more appreciated?
I mean, I don't expect much. You know, I mean, I have a fantasy that like I'll sell 1 million copies, and, you know, be this big deal. But that's probably not going to happen. You know, Edinger says that that individuation is not a widespread event. And I think that applies to this kind of stuff too. You know, So I don't expect like a mass movement. I wish there was. Um my whole I mean, what I want people to recognize, that I wish I could really convey is that this process that we're engaged in the rooms is a really profound process that we looked at this last week, that only Carl Jung himself could really ever encompass it, which is if you're familiar with Jung, then you recognize how much praise that really is sort of, bestowing on the 12 steps and on Bill Wilson's practice. Like this is a really, really deep and meaningful thing that we're engaged with. But it's also, there's another aspect of it where it's just simply a container where we can put our compulsions and safely hold them. That, I just read this the other day. Edinger says that the spiritual community is always very healthy until an individual within the community realizes that they need to break out of it for whatever reason, that the self is driving them towards something deeper. And when that happens for that individual only, not for the collective, but for the individual, then the container then can become actually more damaging than it is helpful, right? But for the vast majority, the container will be helpful. And it is helpful, right? It's helpful to our families, it's helpful to our communities. And I'm unfortunately relegated to the idea that most people in the container are not really trying to break out of it. So
Thanks, Cody. Thanks for your question. Dave, Terry. Whoops.
Here we go. Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to articulate this, okay? Because what I'm seeing is, because I'll just say, when I saw step 2, that was the freeing thing. Is not the God word, not but the higher power to restore me to sanity. I could see the insanity, and a higher power could mean anything. It alludes to step 3. And a higher power could be a sponsor, someone else with more experience, strength, and hope. So I feel like step 2 just opened up this idea of multiplicity of a higher power. But also I see that there is humility that's involved to really open us up beyond our own ideas. So I love the process. But what I'm seeing is that this is an opening up of hope, humility, that it's implicit, in the steps. And just wondering also how this is playing into things like IFS, internal family systems, and the ACA ideas of reparenting ourselves. And that self is also to this kind of a widening perspective, a capacity. Don't quite know how to articulate my question. Let's see what you can make of it.
yeah, I'll do my best. Well, I'm not super familiar with IFS, but I do think it's interesting the way it categorizes different aspects of the psyche and sort of like it almost makes them into archetypes, right? And they are, in Jungian terms, they are archetypes, like the child and the parent, the mother, the father. And so I think that that's a useful process. And I'm all about it. For people who that works for, for me, I'm just hyper interested in Jung stuff right now for whatever reason that is. I don't know why, but I've been having a lot of fun just getting into my own dreams and trying to understand that stuff as best I can. So thanks, Terry. I love seeing you. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you, Cody. Can we watch the Matrix trilogy together sometime with Dave?
Yeah, let's do it. We should have a Netflix watch party.
All right, we're going to set that up after the book study. Cody, today was so rich, so much packed into this chapter. One of my favorite parts was it talked about, well, I can't remember the quote exactly, but it suggests that if I go searching into my shadow, my unconscious or what have you, that this will melt a barrier that may have been there or something like that. And then, I'll get access just because I went looking for it. And then things start shifting and moving around. If I don't go looking for it, I may not get access, something like that. Maybe you'd say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Edinger says that when we pay attention to the unconscious, it tends to respond in kind. And that however, whatever attitude we take towards it, it's going to reflect that attitude back to us, right? And I know it's really almost overwhelming to be standing like at the beginning of this journey inward, because it's literally the very last, like, as Western individuals, we do not understand how to go inward. It literally goes against everything that our culture and that our society tells us to do. And so what I've tried to do in the book is sort of lay it out in this way that we can start to understand. So, like, if we understand the God image as like this empirical sort of complex that exists in the human psyche, so we can't really like touch it, right? We can't set it on the table and study it, right, and measure it and whatever, but that we can prove that it's there. That's the thing. Jung considered himself an empiricist, that his psychology was an empirical psychology, so that these things are actually, so when they asked Jung, do you believe in God, he said, I don't believe, I know. Right? He knows, because he's essentially saying that, yes, the God image is an actual complex that exists in the human psyche of practically every human. And so then the question is, and so the journey within then is not as hard as we want to kind of make it seem. We're already really close to it, that we're like fish swimming in the sea of the unconscious, right? And so it's not as hard as we make it. And it starts with step one, right? We admitted we were powerless. That's already a step into the unconscious, because we've been suffering from this delusion, this complex. The alcoholic mind is what Wilson calls it, which is genius. That this thing drives us, right? And that it's driven us to either drink or use drugs multiple times in the past. If we're sober any amount of time, guaranteed it's driving us to do other stupid shit. So, and so then we ask ourselves, what is that, right? What is it? What part of the psyche in my own mind wants to kill me? Because it's clear that there is something in my mind that would rather, almost seemingly rather, have me dead. So already, just to even see that, I'm taking a journey into the unconscious. So then the next question, then we go to step two, step three.
Watch. This is how my dad got a flat belly at 60s.
So basically, so yeah, I'm glad Yisrael's watching a commercial. I love that. I got lost. I lost tracks of my thoughts, but that's all right. No, but so yeah. Anyways, here today we're taking the first steps into the unconscious, because we're examining, after step one, we're examining this God image, which also is in there. When I think about the God image, I mean, even if I believe that it's out there somewhere, I'm not looking out there to see it. I'm looking in here. And so I'm venturing into the unconscious.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm glad flat belly something.
It said that's how my dad got a flat belly at 60. Send me that, Yisrael. I need it. I need that.
We still have just a few minutes. Freud had the theory of desire for death. Deborah C.
So I'll read you guys this little thing if I can find it. And this is Goethe. It reminds me of that. It says, maybe. It says that living, okay, so let me start over. This is Goethe and Faust. It says, that livingness I praise, which longs for flaming death. So, which is very interesting, right? I guess the sentiment being that I mean, who else is pursuing a flaming death more than like the fentanyl addict today, right? Like that is you know, in a very real sense the kind of living that Goethe would praise. So, Sharon.
Cody, again, thank you. I have a feeling, and tell me what your experience is, that the 12 steps for certain people in the container are really, they're beginning to go into the shadow work, which is what you're saying. But as you get further into the process of doing your steps, that you're going more toward your own shadow and you go deeper into it, right?
Yeah. I mean, the steps are, in my understanding, is they really, that is that is shadow work, you know, because we're the process of like bringing this stuff to my sponsor and then being open-minded for his feedback is shadow work, you know, and um it's there, it's a layer, at least a layer of it, you know. I like, for me, like I got to a point where to go much further, like I had to go deeper. So I got a therapist, right? And then I spent 2.5 years, you know, weekly sessions, essentially doing more shadow work, getting more into the stuff below the surface that a sponsor just, like, frankly probably wouldn't have time to lead me into, you know. My sponsor is not going to want to listen to me blither on for an hour every week about whatever. So for me that became an important kind of necessary step, you know. And then that's, so those two layers are sort of this reductive layer, and then below that is another layer that's you know, what Jung called the archetypal layer, or yeah. And it is shadow work, you know. It's and it's also the spiritual process, you know. So um you know, like it or not, we're engaged in psychology here in the 12 steps.
I
So
thank you. I look forward to your coming sessions. I really do. This today was absolutely premier for me. I'm enthused as heck. I'll be
cool.
Thank you, Sharon. There's a question in the chat. Is it the ego that gets in the way of believing in God? It is something I struggle with myself.
Yeah, I love that question. I really love that question. Um, and I think the answer is yes, it is the ego. But I think also perhaps the question could be reformulated, right? Because to have a belief in God, so, and I know that we talk about this in the steps, but it's a little different, right? The process of step 2 is not that I choose to believe in, right? The step actually is more passive. It says that I came to believe, that this happens to me. Some of the steps are these active processes that we engage in. I write stuff down, I go to make amends, right? But there's other steps that I think maybe they're more important, maybe not, whatever, it doesn't matter, but they actually happen to me. And step 2 is one of those, that I came to believe. And so it's not a matter of like of the ego can't force itself to believe in something, right? This belief sort of, it percolates from inside. And so it might be useful to reformulate the question. We're going to talk more about this stuff in the coming chapters, is like, because to me it sounds like, okay, so while I was writing the book, a close friend of mine said, do you believe in hell, right? And I was like, no. But aside from it, the point is that this this basically speaks of believing in something that's outside of yourself. And Bill's going to tell us, we're going to see this in the next chapter, that he says in the last analysis, we only find God inside of us, right? So the question isn't about believing in the God, the czar of heaven or whatever that thing is out there, but it's about finding something inside of myself to believe in, that's transcendent of the ego. So it's not believing in the ego's power to solve these problems, but it's believing that I can tap into something greater than the ego that will solve the problem. So thank you for asking the question. And I mean, obviously we do step work, that helps too. But if you kind of join us on this journey, maybe some belief will begin to manifest in your life as you just try to see it in a different way, you know?
Thank you. We are at the top of the hour. There was a chat message to me.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Oh, okay, great.
No problem.